At its peak, Pilgrim State Hospital held 13,875 patients, more people than many American towns. It had its own power plant, police force, fire department, and cemetery, but the number that truly shaped Pilgrim was not 13,875. It was $7 million, the amount New York saved by building one enormous hospital instead of two smaller ones. What began as a practical decision would eventually turn human beings into numbers inside the largest mental hospital the world had ever seen. In the late 1920s, New York State was running out of places to put the mentally ill. The problem had been building for years. State hospitals that had once been praised as orderly retreats had become crowded institutions holding far more people than their original walls were meant to contain. Some patients slept in day rooms. Others were transferred from one facility to another, not because their treatment had changed, but because the system needed another bed. The state did not lack concern, it lacked space. In 1927, Governor Al Smith asked for 10,000 additional beds for New York's public mental hospitals. The request was not abstract. Behind it were people who had been waiting in county institutions, poorhouses, jails, and hospital wards that could no longer keep them. New York needed a solution large enough to change the numbers quickly. Officials considered building two new hospitals, each designed for 5,000 patients. The estimated cost was $30 million. Then another proposal was placed beside it. One hospital, 10,000 beds. Estimated cost, $23 million. The difference was $7 million. On paper, the choice was difficult to resist. One enormous institution would require fewer duplicated services. It could operate one power plant instead of two, one central administration instead of two, and one network of kitchens, laundries, maintenance shops, and medical departments. The state could create the same number of beds while saving nearly a quarter of the projected cost. There was nothing secret about the calculation. There was no hidden meeting in which officials planned to create a place of suffering. The decision belonged to the ordinary language of government: capacity, efficiency, construction, and cost. That is what made it so consequential. Before a single patient arrived, Pilgrim had already been shaped by a question that had little to do with medicine. How many people could one institution hold for the lowest possible price? The New York legislature authorized the new hospital in 1929. It was named for Dr. Charles Winfield Pilgrim, a respected physician who had spent decades in the state hospital system and had once served as president of the New York State Commission in Lunacy. The site chosen was in Brentwood on Long Island, far from the dense streets of Manhattan and Brooklyn. There was room for broad roads, lawns, farms, utility buildings, and long rows of patient wards. The countryside offered air, sunlight, work, and order. This was not yet the image of an asylum in decline. Pilgrim was conceived as an answer to decline. Its planners believed that a modern institution could replace the confusion of overcrowded hospitals with rational design. Patients would be separated according to their medical needs. They would receive food, shelter, supervision, recreation, and treatment in buildings created specifically for that purpose. The hospital would have enough land to prevent the claustrophobia of older urban institutions. It would have enough workshops and farms to give useful occupation to those able to work. It would be large because the need was large. Construction began on a scale that resembled the founding of a town. Roads had to be laid across the property. Water, sewage, heat, and electricity had to reach buildings that did not yet exist. Kitchens would have to feed thousands of people. Laundries would have to clean mountains of bedding and clothing. A medical institution was being planned, but so was a municipal system. Every practical decision carried the original calculation within it. One central plant, one administration, one hospital for 10,000 lives. Pilgrim State Hospital officially opened on October 1, 1931. Its first population was modest, 100 patients. Against the size of the grounds, they must have seemed almost lost. New buildings stood beside unfinished roads. Open land stretched beyond the occupied wards. For a brief moment, Pilgrim contained more promise than history. The patients arriving there were not entering an ancient fortress or a decaying institution inherited from another century. They were entering one of the newest public hospitals in the United States. The walls were clean, the systems were modern. The state had spent millions of dollars to create space for people whom the older hospitals could no longer receive. It is easy, looking backward, to treat the scale as an obvious warning. It did not appear that way in 1931. To state officials, size represented relief. To families, an available bed could mean professional care after months or years of exhaustion. To physicians, the new hospital promised room to classify patients properly and separate temporary illness from long-term disability. To local workers, the institution promised stable employment during the early years of the Great Depression. Pilgrim did not begin as a place society intended to forget. It began as proof that society was finally willing to act. But the hospital's first 100 patients were not the true test of its design. The test would come when the rest of New York discovered that Pilgrim had room. Transfers began. New admissions followed. Patients who had spent years in older institutions were sent east to Brentwood. The open buildings filled, and the unfinished buildings were prepared for those already on the way. Within 9 months, the population had risen from 100 to 2,018. The hospital was still under construction. The state had built Pilgrim so large that it would never have to say there was no room. Now the existence of that room created its own demand. 2 decades later, a Long Island mother named Beulah Jones would pass through Pilgrim's gates. Her family believed she was entering a hospital where doctors would make her well enough to return home. She would remain there for nearly 20 years. By then, the $7 million decision had become a city. The $7 million saving did more than determine Pilgrim's size. It determined what Pilgrim had to become. A hospital built for several hundred patients could depend on the town beyond its gates. A hospital intended for 10,000 could not. It required water, electricity, kitchens, transportation, and public services on the scale of an independent community. Pilgrim would have to provide those things for itself. The result was not simply a collection of wards. It was a self-contained city built around illness. Across the Long Island plain, workers laid out straight roads between broad groups of red brick buildings. Patient wards stood near administrative offices, medical departments, kitchens, laundries, workshops, and storage facilities. Underground tunnels connected many wards to central dining rooms, allowing thousands of meals to move through the institution without sending the entire population into bad weather. The tunnels reflected the thinking of the time. The superintendents who helped design Pilgrim were concerned with security, order, and the controlled movement of large numbers of people. Every route had a purpose. Every building had a number. Every population could be separated, counted, and directed. Above ground, the hospital generated its own electricity. It pumped its own water and operated its own heating plant and sewage system. It maintained a fire department and a police force. It had courts, religious services, a post office, a cemetery, athletic fields, greenhouses, a farm, a laundry, a store, and an amusement hall. These were not decorative additions. They were the organs required to keep the institution alive. A power failure could darken wards holding thousands of vulnerable people. A broken boiler could endanger entire buildings. Food had to be grown, purchased, prepared, and delivered on a scale that turned every meal into an industrial operation. The hospital director was responsible not only for medicine, but for roads, fuel, plumbing, fire protection, machinery, waste, and a vast workforce. Pilgrim needed doctors and nurses, but also engineers, cooks, farmers, mechanics, police officers, attendants, clerks, and laborers. The institution was designed to cure minds, but it survived by mastering logistics. There was genuine optimism behind this design. Many of the older hospitals New York was trying to relieve had been swallowed by their own populations. Buildings intended as quiet retreats had become crowded places where privacy, recreation, and careful treatment were increasingly difficult to provide. Pilgrim offered land. There would be sunlight between the buildings. Patients who were able could walk outdoors, work on the farm, tend plants, join recreation programs, or follow routines that physicians believed might restore stability. Work, fresh air, regular meals, exercise, and ordered days were still regarded as forms of treatment. For families who had watched a relative deteriorate at home, this could look like mercy. Pilgrim offered trained supervision, medical care, protection, and a bed in a system that had been turning desperate people away. A hospital this large could also maintain services that smaller institutions might not afford. It could separate new admissions from those needing long-term care. It could operate workshops, medical departments, and recreation programs. The scale itself could seem humane. That was the promise. But a city built for 10,000 people also required rules designed for 10,000 people. The same tunnels that protected patients from rain allowed groups to be moved under supervision. The same numbered buildings that made the campus legible to administrators could make wards feel interchangeable. The same central kitchens that fed thousands efficiently placed distance between the person eating and the person preparing the meal. Efficiency was necessary. It also changed the relationship between the institution and the people inside it. A patient entering Pilgrim passed into a system of classification. Men and women were separated. New arrivals were observed. Those believed likely to improve could remain near treatment services. Those judged to need longer care were moved elsewhere. The architecture gave physical form to medical judgment. One building could represent hope of discharge. Another could become a place where time was measured in years. Catherine Elliott arrived at Pilgrim in 1932, when much of the campus was still unfinished. The city that later appeared permanent and orderly was then raw earth, sand, machinery, and isolated brick buildings standing without mature trees or established lawns. The hospital had opened, but construction had not caught up with its purpose. Patients were already arriving from Kings Park and other overcrowded state hospitals. Many were not new cases entering treatment for the first time. They were people who had lived in institutions for years and were considered among the most difficult to manage or least likely to recover. Pilgrim had been planned as a modern hospital. The older system began filling it with the cases it could no longer carry. Elliott remembered buses arriving with patients restrained in camisoles. Staff brought them into the wards, locked the doors, and wrote their names on their backs in gentian violet before releasing them into the rooms. The detail contains two truths. The staff needed to know who these people were. Pilgrim was receiving groups of disoriented patients into unfinished wards, often without workers who knew their faces or histories. Writing the names was a practical response to confusion. It also revealed how quickly a person could lose the ordinary signs of identity inside a mass institution. A name was no longer something spoken across a kitchen table. It was a label applied so the hospital would not misplace the body carrying it. Pilgrim had been built to relieve overcrowding. Yet almost from the beginning, it inherited the habits overcrowding had produced: locked doors, rigid movement, mass classification, and constant counting. The lawns would grow, the roads would be completed. Trees would soften the severe lines of the buildings. In time, Pilgrim would look more like the permanent city its planners had imagined. But the pressure had arrived before the city was ready. The buildings were still rising. The patients were already coming faster than Pilgrim could learn their names. By the summer of 1932, Pilgrim State Hospital held 2,018 patients. 9 months earlier, it had opened with 100. The increase did not mean that 2,000 people had suddenly developed mental illness on Long Island. It meant New York had finally created a place large enough to receive people already waiting elsewhere. They came from crowded hospitals, public wards, county institutions, and families that could no longer provide care at home. Many had been hospitalized for years. Others were frightened, violent, withdrawn, or unable to care for themselves. Pilgrim had been designed to sort these needs into an orderly system, but order requires time. The hospital was still laying roads, opening buildings, hiring employees, and constructing services for a population increasing almost by the day. Staff members who had not yet learned the campus were receiving patients whose histories they scarcely knew. New wards became occupied as soon as they were usable. The future city was being filled one unfinished section at a time. The pressure changed the institution before the institution had fully taken shape. A hospital treating a small number of people can begin with the individual. A hospital receiving patients by the busload must begin with movement. Who had arrived, where each person would sleep, which door had to remain locked, who required close supervision, who might harm himself or someone nearby. These were necessary questions. In a ward filled with distressed or confused people, a mistake could have serious consequences. But the questions also established a pattern. Pilgrim first had to know where a patient belonged. Only afterward could it ask who that patient had been before arriving. The architecture turned judgment into geography. There were admission buildings for new patients, locked wards for those considered dangerous or severely disturbed, and other buildings for people expected to remain for years. A transfer between wards could represent improvement. It could also mark the quiet abandonment of hope. Those decisions were made within the limits of the medicine available at the time. There were no modern antipsychotic drugs. For many conditions, diagnosis remained uncertain, and treatment offered routine, supervision, sedation, restraint, occupation, and protection from immediate harm. For some patients, that protection mattered. Pilgrim gave food and shelter to people who might otherwise have lived in poorhouses or jails. It provided medical attention, religious services, recreation, and structured work. Some patients improved. Some eventually left. Others entered a system more prepared to keep them than to cure them. The language inside the hospital reflected that division. There were recent cases and chronic cases. There were patients with a favorable prognosis and those considered unlikely to recover. There were people who could work and people who required nursing care. Each category helped Pilgrim manage its population. Each category could also become a future. Once a patient was regarded as chronic, expectations changed. Treatment could give way to maintenance. The purpose of the ward became less about preparing a person to leave and more about carrying that person safely through another day. The difference was rarely announced in a single decision. It appeared gradually in fewer examinations, longer intervals between family visits, years spent in the same building, and records that grew thicker while life outside became more distant. Pilgrim had no wall around its entire campus. From the road, it could resemble a college or a carefully planned town. Yet for most patients, the boundary between the institution and the outside world remained absolute. Windows were barred, doors were locked, movement occurred in groups. Hospital clothing made patients recognizable. Daily life followed schedules created by people who possessed the keys. The city had two populations. One gave orders, the other lived by them. This did not mean every employee was cruel, or that every patient experienced Pilgrim in the same way. Many attendants and nurses tried to preserve dignity in conditions that made dignity difficult. They washed patients, fed them, prevented injuries, and remembered names that the larger system reduced to files. But kindness could not alter the mathematics of the place. Every new arrival increased the work. Every filled ward narrowed the time available for the person in each bed. As the census rose, Pilgrim depended more heavily on routines that could be repeated across hundreds of rooms. Pilgrim had been created to end overcrowding. Its enormous capacity allowed the overcrowded system to continue sending people east. During the Second World War, the contradiction appeared in another part of the same landscape. The United States Army took over nearby Edgewood State Hospital and several Pilgrim buildings as part of Mason General Hospital. There, soldiers with psychological injuries were treated with the stated goal of returning them to civilian life. In 1945, director John Huston filmed some of those men for Let There Be Light. The camera followed veterans through interviews, group therapy, hypnosis, and rehabilitation. They were presented not as permanent inmates, but as injured men capable of recovery. The army withheld the film from public release for decades. The comparison was imperfect. The soldiers were generally younger, their conditions were linked to wartime trauma, and they entered a program built around discharge. Pilgrim's civilian population included many people with severe, recurring illnesses and years of institutional history. Still, the two systems stood close enough to expose a difference in expectation. At Mason General, the patient was being prepared to return to society. At Pilgrim, thousands were being prepared to remain. There was no single morning when Pilgrim ceased to be the hopeful hospital imagined in 1929. No official signed a paper declaring that custody would now matter more than recovery. The change arrived through accumulation. Another bus, another bed, another locked ward, another person classified as chronic. By the time Pilgrim was physically complete, the institution had learned its most important skill. It knew how to receive people faster than it could return them. The city had been built to cure. It was becoming very good at keeping. By 1954, Pilgrim State Hospital held 13,875 patients. The number made it the largest mental institution of its kind in the world. But a number that large is difficult to picture. It becomes more understandable when Pilgrim is compared not to another hospital, but to an American town. It had the population of a small city. It had 11 miles of roads, a power plant, wells, pumps, a sewage system, repair shops, a police force, a library, theaters, stores, and a cemetery. Across the grounds stood 125 buildings, most identified by numbers rather than names. There was Building 1, Building 2, Building 3. The pattern continued across the campus. A normal town of nearly 14,000 people would contain thousands of private kitchens, bedrooms, front doors, and telephones. Pilgrim concentrated the same population into wards, dormitories, and central services. In 1961, its patients ordinarily had access to only 29 telephones, all of them pay phones. 10 kitchens prepared one common menu. On some mornings, the plan required more than 800 gallons of hot cereal. The scale was impressive because it had to be. Every day began with obligations that could not be postponed. Boilers had to produce heat. Food had to reach the wards. Bedding had to be collected, washed, and returned. Medication had to be measured. Doors had to be checked. Thousands of patients had to be counted. Pilgrim could not improvise its way through a morning. It survived through routine. A missed delivery could leave a ward without clean clothing. A failed boiler could endanger an entire building. A shortage of attendants could turn an ordinary disturbance into an emergency. The director was responsible for medicine, but also for fuel, roads, machinery, waste disposal, employee disputes, police radios, and the storage of enough towels for nearly 14,000 patients. The hospital had become too large for medicine to stand apart from municipal government. It had also become too large for any one person to understand completely. A superintendent could know the census. A clerk could know how many beds were occupied. A physician could know the patients assigned to one service. An attendant could recognize the faces in one day room. No one could know all 13,875 lives. The institution therefore depended on categories: new admissions, acute cases, long-term cases, geriatric patients, open wards, locked wards, able to work, unable to work, likely to leave, unlikely to leave. The categories were necessary. They helped doctors decide where care could be concentrated and attendants understand the risks in a ward. But a category could also become the most important fact about a person. A patient judged unlikely to recover could be moved farther from the admission buildings and closer to the permanent population. Someone who entered Pilgrim during a crisis could slowly become part of the institution's background. The days continued, meals arrived, laundry returned, the census was taken again. This was not the whole life of Pilgrim. Patients attended religious services, watched films, joined recreational programs, worked in shops, tended grounds, and walked along the straight roads. Some formed friendships that lasted for years. Some found greater safety inside Pilgrim than they had known outside it. Many employees tried to preserve ordinary human contact. Nurses remembered preferences. Attendants helped patients dress. Doctors stopped in corridors to speak with people whose names might otherwise have remained on paper. The effort mattered. It also revealed the size of the problem. Henry Brill, who arrived at Pilgrim as a young doctor in 1932 and later became its director, understood the danger. By 1961, he acknowledged that psychiatry was moving away from institutions of this size, partly because they could become impersonal. Pilgrim had been designed around the belief that one central system could care for 10,000 people more efficiently than two smaller hospitals. Efficiency had been achieved. The power plant worked. The kitchen served their meals. The buses delivered new patients. The wards remained in operation. But efficiency could not answer what each person needed in order to recover. A person in authority might stop beside a frightened patient and speak gently for 2 minutes. In a private doctor's office, 2 minutes would scarcely qualify as treatment. Inside Pilgrim, those minutes could become an example for an entire ward. Brill believed respect could spread downward through an institution. If the director treated one patient as a person, perhaps doctors, nurses, and attendants would do the same. It was a humane idea. It was also an admission that dignity had to travel through layers of authority before reaching the bed. By the time Pilgrim reached its peak, it contained almost every contradiction of the public mental hospital. It was a refuge and a place of confinement. It offered medical care and enforced obedience. It protected people whom families and communities could not safely support. It also allowed those same communities to place difficult lives out of sight. Pilgrim's size made specialized care possible. The same size made neglect easier to hide. 13,875 patients did not experience the same hospital. One might live in an open ward and work outdoors. Another might spend years behind a locked door. One might improve and leave within months. Another might watch the seasons change from the same building for decades. The census placed them together. Their lives remained separate. Among those lives was Beulah Jones, a Long Island mother admitted in 1952. Her family had been told that Pilgrim was a hospital and that doctors would try to make her well. By the time she arrived, Pilgrim had learned how to house a population larger than many towns. It had not learned how to cure everyone inside it. The institution now faced a different question. When treatment failed to return a person to ordinary life, what counted as success? For a hospital responsible for nearly 14,000 patients, the answer could not remain theoretical. It would determine what happened next. Before the middle of the 20th century, a psychiatrist at Pilgrim could identify a patient's illness without possessing any reliable way to change its course. A person might hear voices, refuse food, remain motionless for days, strike attendants, tear clothing, or live under a delusion no argument could reach. Some patients arrived during a temporary crisis. Others had been ill for years. The hospital could provide shelter, supervision, routine, and protection. It could not always provide recovery. For the most disturbed patients, the first treatments were often designed to calm the body. A person might be restrained in a camisole, isolated in a room wrapped in wet sheets beneath heavy blankets, or placed for hours in a continuous bath of warm water. These methods belong to an old theory. If the body could be made still, perhaps the mind would follow. The results were limited. A patient might become quiet without becoming well. The behavior could stop while the fear, grief, or hallucination remained. Once the restraint was removed or the sedative faded, the disturbance could return. Pilgrim needed something more effective. In 1937, the hospital began regularly using insulin coma therapy. Large doses of insulin reduced the patient's blood sugar until unconsciousness followed. The treatment was physically dangerous and required close supervision, but some physicians believed it reduced delusions and violent behavior in certain patients. The following year, Pilgrim added metrazole. Instead of producing a coma, the drug produced convulsions. Then, in 1940, electric shock began replacing metrazole. It was faster, more predictable, and easier to administer. Patients with severe depression sometimes improved significantly. Others improved only temporarily or not at all. The arrival of each method created hope because the alternatives were so poor. Doctors were not choosing between these treatments and the psychiatric care available today. They were choosing between experimental physical interventions and a future of sedation, restraint, locked wards, and permanent confinement. That distinction matters. It does not erase what happened next. At a smaller hospital, a new treatment might remain the decision of one physician caring for one patient. At Pilgrim, any method believed to work had to confront a population measured in thousands. The hospital possessed its own operating rooms, medical staff, record system, and wards filled with people who had not responded to earlier treatments. Once a procedure became accepted, Pilgrim could apply it at a scale few institutions could match. Treatment became a program. Patients were examined, classified, approved, prepared, treated, observed, and returned to the wards. Outcomes were entered into charts, results were grouped into categories: improved, unimproved, discharged, still hospitalized, dead. In 1945, doctors at Pilgrim began performing prefrontal lobotomies. The operation severed pathways connecting the frontal regions of the brain with deeper structures. Physicians hoped that interrupting those pathways might weaken the fixed fears, compulsions, delusions, and violent impulses that had resisted every other method. The procedure was not introduced as punishment. It was introduced as treatment for patients described as intractably ill. That phrase carried enormous authority. An intractable patient was someone whose illness had resisted ordinary procedures. But within an institution, the term could also describe a person whose behavior demanded constant labor, repeated restraint, and more attention than an overcrowded ward could provide. The medical problem and the administrative problem began to overlap. Between 1945 and 1955, approximately 1,600 Pilgrim patients underwent the operation. In 1947, the hospital began a formal 2-year study. Its title was direct: 350 Cases of Prefrontal Lobotomy. The authors were Harry Worthing, Henry Brill, and Henry Wigderson. Their report examined the procedure through the language available to the institution. They considered whether patients became less disturbed, required less restraint, behaved more cooperatively, or could be released. Of the 350 patients in the study, 65 went home. The rest remained in the hospital or had died by the end of the study period. Yet the doctors did not regard the results as a simple failure. Some patients who remained institutionalized became calmer. Others no longer required continuous sedation or restraint. Their suffering appeared reduced. Their wards became easier to operate. By 1948, Pilgrim was performing more than 200 lobotomies a year. At that speed, the procedure was no longer an exceptional last act occurring only a few times. It had become part of the hospital's institutional machinery. A patient could enter the operating room carrying years of illness, fear, family history, and failed treatment. The record reduced that life to a case number. The hospital's definition of improvement was the central problem. If a man stopped striking attendants after surgery, the ward was safer. If a woman no longer screamed through the night, other patients could sleep. If someone who had required restraints could now sit quietly in a day room, the change was real. But quietness was not the same as recovery. Cooperation was not the same as restored judgment. A reduction in distress could arrive with apathy, impaired initiative, emotional flattening, or the loss of abilities that had once belonged to the patient. The operation could remove part of the problem by removing part of the person who experienced it. Some patients did leave Pilgrim after lobotomy. Historical accounts do not support the claim that every operation produced the same result. A few families believed the procedure had made an otherwise impossible life more manageable. Others received back someone profoundly changed. Many received no one back at all. The hospital continued measuring what it could see: fewer assaults, less resistance, reduced need for restraints, a transfer to a quieter ward, a discharge. What it could not measure as easily was what had disappeared inside the patient. At Pilgrim's scale, that uncertainty entered a system designed to repeat whatever appeared useful. The power plant generated electricity for the wards, the kitchens produced thousands of meals, the laundry processed thousands of sheets, and the medical departments processed patients through treatments whose success could be defined by how little difficulty those patients caused afterward. Pilgrim did not invent the therapies of its era. Insulin coma, convulsive treatment, electric shock, and lobotomy were used in institutions across the United States and abroad. Pilgrim revealed what happened when those therapies met the largest psychiatric population in the world. Medicine became logistics, judgment became classification, and treatment could become a production line. Among the women moving through that system was Beulah Jones. She had already received 15 electric shock treatments in 10 weeks. The voices and delusions remained. Her doctors now proposed another procedure. On the day Beulah entered the operating room, she would not be alone. 11 other patients were scheduled with her. Before Beulah Jones became a patient at Pilgrim, she had already lived through years that demanded endurance. She was born into a family of 12 children and spent part of the Great Depression in Kansas, where the family lived first in a boxcar and later in an abandoned house. In 1932, when she was 15, an uncle invited her to Long Island. She married Herbert Jones in 1939 and became the mother of 3 children. Her illness emerged after the birth of the youngest. Beulah began hearing voices. She developed the belief that she was the lost Queen of Scotland. At times she became agitated and difficult for the family to manage. The surviving accounts come largely from her children and granddaughter, who later studied hundreds of pages of hospital records. They do not reconstruct every private moment. They do show a family confronting an illness they did not understand, at a time when the available treatments were few. Herbert brought Beulah to Pilgrim State Hospital in 1952. Their children were told that she would be gone for about 6 months. One daughter later remembered standing on the lawn outside a ward and looking up at barred windows. She asked why her mother was in jail. Her father told her it was not a jail. It was a hospital. The doctors were going to make her better. Inside Pilgrim, Beulah entered a medical system responsible for nearly 14,000 patients. Her symptoms were observed, recorded, and treated according to the methods then available. Over 10 weeks, she received 15 electric shock treatments. The treatments did not end her delusions. Her doctors then recommended a leucotomy, a form of prefrontal lobotomy. They presented it to Herbert as the best remaining option. According to the family, he appeared before a board of doctors and was told that the operation could remove Beulah's violent behavior and make her more manageable. He agreed. It is tempting to place the entire moral weight of that decision on one signature. That would make the story easier than it was. Herbert was not a neurologist. He was a husband caring for 3 children while his wife lived behind locked doors. The recommendation came from physicians working inside one of the largest hospitals in the world. Lobotomy had entered mainstream medicine. Its originator had received the Nobel Prize. Medical authorities were presenting the operation not as cruelty, but as progress. The family was asked to trust the institution. They did. On the day of Beulah's operation, surgeons made 2 openings above her hairline and used an instrument to sever tissue in the frontal regions of her brain. She was one of 12 Pilgrim patients operated on that day. The number matters because it reveals how an intervention described as a last resort could function inside an institution of this size. 12 families had histories. 12 patients had fears, habits, memories, and illnesses that did not resemble one another in every detail. On the operating schedule, they became a day's work. Pilgrim did not treat Beulah casually because no one cared whether she lived. The operation required doctors, nurses, equipment, records, and post-operative observation, but clinical seriousness is not the same as restraint. A system can approach each operation carefully while repeating it so often that the person disappears behind the procedure. The family waited for the change they had been promised. Beulah survived. Her delusions did not disappear. Her daughter later said that the clearest difference was not the removal of the illness, but the loss of what she called her mother's higher intellect. Beulah could no longer sit and read as she once had. Writing became difficult. Her long-term memory was severely impaired. She seemed able to live only in the immediate moment. The violence may have been reduced. So was something else. Pilgrim observed Beulah for approximately 6 months after surgery. According to her granddaughter, when the hospital concluded that the operation had not relieved the delusions, Beulah was transferred to a ward for patients considered untreatable. The word did more than describe a medical judgment. It changed the purpose of her care. Before the operation, Beulah was a patient being moved through treatments intended to alter her condition. After the operation failed, the institution was prepared to contain her condition. The family continued visiting. One daughter remembered seeing her mother through bars and hearing Beulah recognize her children. The promised 6 months passed, then a year, then 10 years. Hope did not end at once. It diminished through repetition, the same journey to Brentwood, the same buildings, the same separation between the family outside and the mother within. Beulah remained at Pilgrim until 1972. By then, lobotomy had fallen from favor. New antipsychotic drugs had helped thousands of patients leave state hospitals. Pilgrim's population was shrinking, and wards once filled beyond capacity were closing. None of that restored what Beulah had lost. Her story does not prove that every patient at Pilgrim received the same treatment or suffered the same outcome. Some people improved after surgery. Some families believed it relieved unbearable distress. The medical record of the period is neither simple nor uniform, but Beulah's case reveals the danger hidden inside institutional definitions of success. The operation was intended to remove behavior that made her difficult to manage. It did not remove the delusions, it did make her quieter. For the ward, that difference could be recorded as improvement. For her children, it meant that the mother they hoped to bring home was still alive, still recognized them, and was no longer fully the person who had entered Pilgrim. 12 operations were completed that day. The hospital moved on to the next schedule. The Jones family carried one of them for the next 20 years, and while Beulah remained behind Pilgrim's doors, a new kind of treatment was beginning to open them. While Beulah Jones remained in a ward at Pilgrim, psychiatry entered a new era. The change began far from Long Island. In the early 1950s, physicians in France found that a compound called chlorpromazine produced a powerful calming effect. It did not render every patient unconscious. It could reduce hallucinations, agitation, and disordered thinking while leaving some people alert enough to speak, work, and take part in ordinary activity. For hospitals accustomed to restraints, heavy sedation, shock treatment, and surgery, the possibility was difficult to overstate. New York State began testing the new tranquilizing drugs on a large scale in 1954. Pilgrim, with the largest psychiatric population in the world, became one of the places where the change could be seen most clearly. The effect was not a cure. Some patients did not respond. Others became drowsy, emotionally flattened, or physically slowed. Medication could quiet a person without resolving the illness that had brought that person to the hospital. The drugs also required continued use. When patients stopped taking them, symptoms could return. But for many people, something changed that had rarely changed before. The voices became less commanding. The terror loosened. The impulse to strike an attendant or flee through a window diminished. A patient who had been too disturbed to sit through a conversation could now remain long enough to be interviewed. Someone who had spent the day pacing or screaming might be able to join occupational therapy, attend a film, or walk outside. The drugs did not replace human care. They made human care more possible. Henry Brill later argued that the sequence mattered. The change in patient behavior appeared first. Only afterward could Pilgrim safely liberalize its rules, expand recreation, and open the wards. Before the new drugs, almost every ward door had been locked, windows were barred, the broad grounds were largely empty except when attendants moved patients in supervised groups. By 1961, more than half the wards were open. Pilgrim marked the difference with small colored dots. A red dot on a door meant it had to be locked. A green dot meant it could remain open. The symbol was modest, the change behind it was not. A patient could leave a ward without an attendant, cross a lawn, visit the library, buy a soda, or stop to watch a baseball game. Those judged ready received honor cards, allowing them to move freely around the grounds except during scheduled appointments. Only a few hundred patients had once been trusted with that freedom. Within several years, more than 7,000 had it. For a hospital built around controlled movement, this was a quiet revolution. The tunnels that had carried supervised groups beneath the ground were used less often. Bared windows could be replaced. Patients were permitted to wear civilian clothes and keep more of their own belongings. Brill considered giving each patient a small cabinet above the bed, something that could be locked with a personal key. Before the drug era, the hospital routinely removed eyeglasses, money, pocketknives, and other possessions that might be lost, stolen, or used for harm. The cabinet represented a different assumption. A patient might again be trusted to own something. Pilgrim also expanded the activities that had once been difficult to conduct in the most disturbed wards. There were dances, concerts, art programs, sports, films, public speaking, and occupational work. These programs had existed before, but medication allowed more patients to take part in them. The institution had not simply become quieter. For many people, it had become more livable. The numbers began to reflect the change. By the end of 1954, according to Brill, the long growth of New York State hospital population had stopped. In 1955, the system recorded its first significant decline. At Pilgrim, newly admitted patients had a far better chance of leaving than those who had arrived in the early years. Excluding elderly patients admitted with conditions unlikely to improve, Brill estimated that 4 out of 5 new patients would eventually be released, many within 6 months. The contrast with the old institution was severe. In 1941, about 1,300 people left Pilgrim, and roughly half of them left because they had died. By 1960, approximately 3,000 patients departed through direct discharge or convalescent leave. The hospital that had once become skilled at keeping people was learning how to send them home. But release remained an institutional decision. A ward doctor first recommended the patient. A senior psychiatrist reviewed the file and conducted an interview. The questions were practical. Had the voices stopped? Did the patient understand that the beliefs leading to admission had been symptoms? Could the person return to a family, a room, or a job without immediate danger? Some patients were discharged outright, others left on convalescent status and had to report to a state aftercare clinic for medication, psychotherapy, or both. A patient who deteriorated could be returned to Pilgrim. Freedom remained conditional. The new drugs also worked best for some patients and poorly for others. People admitted during a first acute episode often improved rapidly. Those who had lived in back wards for 10 or 20 years faced a different problem. Illness had shaped them, so had the institution. Years without privacy, responsibility, money, or ordinary decisions could leave a person calm enough to walk through an open door but unprepared to live beyond it. Medication could reduce hallucinations. It could not return the years spent inside. It could not restore what surgery had taken from Beulah Jones. Pilgrim's doors were opening, but not for everyone, and not in the same way. For thousands, the green dot meant fresh air, movement, and the possibility of home. For others, the open door revealed a harder question. After years in a city designed to provide every meal, every bed, and every decision, where was a patient supposed to go? By the time Beulah Jones left Pilgrim State Hospital, the institution that had held her for 2 decades was becoming smaller around her. In 1972, one of Beulah's grown daughters received a letter from the hospital. Her mother was being released. The family could come and pick her up. There was no return to the woman who had entered Pilgrim in 1952. Beulah still lived with delusions. According to her family, she could barely write, could no longer read as she once had, and had lost much of her long-term memory. The operation meant to make her well enough to return home had not restored her place in the family. It had helped make her quiet enough to leave the institution. Pilgrim could remove her name from its census. It could not return the 20 years. Across the campus, the same process was occurring on a larger scale. The population that had once approached 14,000 continued to fall. Beds emptied. Wards were consolidated. Buildings that had required attendance, kitchens, heat, laundry, and constant maintenance no longer held the numbers for which they had been designed. The city began to contract. This change is often described by a single word, deinstitutionalization, but it was not one policy, one law, or one day when the gates opened. It developed through several forces moving together. New drugs made it possible for many people to control symptoms outside a locked hospital. Courts and reformers challenged the assumption that mental illness alone justified years of confinement. Public officials increasingly rejected the cost and impersonal character of institutions like Pilgrim. The Community Mental Health Act of 1963 encouraged a future in which treatment would be delivered closer to home. The old hospital had been built around separation. The new ideal was community. For many patients, that change was a genuine liberation. They could choose their clothing, prepare food, visit family, hold jobs, and live without asking permission to cross a lawn. They no longer had to spend a lifetime in a numbered building, because an earlier generation had classified them as chronic. The decline of Pilgrim was not evidence that society had stopped caring. In part, it was evidence that society had recognized the damage institutional life could cause. But the word community concealed an assumption. It assumed that a community was waiting. Inside Pilgrim, almost every necessity had been concentrated in one place. The hospital supplied a bed, meals, medication, heat, supervision, and medical care. It told patients when to wake, where to go, and what would happen next. Outside the gates, those services were divided among landlords, clinics, pharmacies, welfare offices, relatives, and public agencies that did not always communicate with one another. A person could be medically ready to leave Pilgrim and still have nowhere stable to live. A prescription did not provide a room. A clinic appointment did not provide transportation. Freedom did not provide the ability to manage money, prepare meals, or recognize the return of an illness. For someone admitted during a first crisis, with a family and home still waiting, discharge could begin a recovery. For someone who had spent 20 or 30 years inside a state hospital, the same discharge could feel like arrival in a country whose customs had been learned by everyone else. The institution had made most decisions for them. Now independence was expected almost at once. Families often became the missing part of the new system. A husband, daughter, brother, or elderly parent could find that the care once provided by an entire hospital had been returned to a household with little preparation. Some families welcomed that responsibility. Some could not carry it. Others were no longer there. New York created aftercare clinics and expanded community services, and many former patients built stable lives with that support. The historical record does not justify the simple claim that closing state hospitals automatically produced homelessness or imprisonment. The outcome depended on what replaced the hospital. Where housing, continuing treatment, income, and close support were available, people could live with greater freedom and dignity. Where those supports were weak, patients could move between brief hospital stays, unstable housing, shelters, streets, and the criminal justice system. The failure was not the decision to let people leave. It was the belief that leaving was the same as arriving somewhere safe. Pilgrim measured progress in departures. Each discharge reduced the census. Each closed ward proved that fewer people required permanent confinement. Those numbers mattered. They did not show whether the person remained housed 6 months later, kept taking medication, found companionship, or returned through another hospital entrance. The old institution had hidden people behind its walls. The new system could lose them in plain sight. Beulah was released to a family that had continued to visit. Even there, discharge could not undo the consequences of illness, surgery, and 20 years of separation. Her return was both freedom and evidence of what freedom could not repair. Pilgrim's shrinking campus carried the same contradiction. Empty wards meant that fewer people were spending their lives in confinement. They also left behind a physical system built for needs that had not entirely disappeared. The hospital had once offered one answer to every problem: another bed inside Pilgrim. Now the answer was supposed to exist beyond the property line. A room in the community, a place in a clinic, a family willing to help. Sometimes those things existed, sometimes they did not. By the end of the 20th century, Pilgrim was no longer the city of nearly 14,000 patients that New York had built. Large sections of the campus had outlived their original purpose, but the institution had not closed. And in 1996, while other state hospitals were disappearing, the remaining patients and services of 2 older Long Island institutions would be brought through Pilgrim's gates. The city was smaller. Its work was not finished. Pilgrim State Hospital had been built to absorb the overflow of New York's mental hospital system. By the end of the 20th century, it was absorbing the remains of that system. In the autumn of 1996, Kings Park Psychiatric Center and Central Islip Psychiatric Center were consolidated, and their remaining operations moved to the Pilgrim campus. The following year, the 3 institutions were merged under one name: Pilgrim Psychiatric Center. There was a quiet historical irony in that decision. Pilgrim had opened in 1931 partly to relieve overcrowding at hospitals such as Kings Park and Central Islip. 65 years later, those institutions were disappearing into Pilgrim. The hospital, created as an overflow valve, had become the last survivor, but it no longer resembled the city that had once held 13,875 patients. Buildings were emptied. Some were demolished. Others stood unused while vegetation grew around roads that had once carry-on buses, supply trucks, employees, and families arriving for visits. The enormous infrastructure designed for 10,000 beds had become too costly and too large for the institution that remained. The old Pilgrim had been organized around permanence. Its modern replacement was organized around departure. Today, Pilgrim Psychiatric Center continues to provide inpatient and outpatient care for adults with severe mental illness. Its inpatient programs operate within modern treatment complexes rather than across the full historic campus. Current services focus on reducing symptoms, restoring daily living skills, and preparing patients to function beyond the hospital. The difference can be seen in the smallest details. The old Pilgrim classified patients according to the wards in which they could be safely kept. The modern Pilgrim operates a model apartment where patients practice cooking, cleaning, managing a household, and preparing for community life. The old institution removed personal possessions because patients could not always be trusted with keys. The modern institution teaches the skills required to hold a key of one's own. There are programs for medication education, stress management, communication, recreation, and independent living. Patients may work with plants in a greenhouse, interact with animals in therapeutic programs, attend classes, or practice ordinary tasks in a kitchen. These services do not erase the history of the ground beneath them. They reveal how completely the meaning of treatment has changed. For most of Pilgrim's early life, success meant making a patient safe enough to remain in the hospital without constant disturbance. Later, success meant making that person stable enough to leave. The institution that once supplied every part of life now tries to prepare people for a life it cannot control. Pilgrim also operates outpatient centers and community programs across Long Island. Its work no longer ends at the gate. Staff members help people manage psychiatric illness while living among families, neighbors, landlords, employers, and strangers. This is the opposite of the original design. The old hospital brought the entire community inside. The modern hospital attempts to bring treatment outside. Yet the continued existence of Pilgrim shows that community care did not eliminate the need for institutions. Some people experience illnesses so severe that outpatient appointments and medication at home are not enough. They may require extended stabilization, protection, rehabilitation, and constant professional care. The question has never been whether those people need help. The question is what form that help should take. Pilgrim once offered the largest possible answer: a 10,000-bed hospital, one power plant, one administration, one city separated from the society beyond it. That answer protected many people from hunger, homelessness, jail, and danger. It also created a place where a human life could be reduced to a ward number, a diagnosis, and a line in the census. The buildings made care possible. Their scale made anonymity almost inevitable. When reform came, New York moved toward the opposite answer. People would live in ordinary communities and receive treatment without surrendering their freedom or identity. That answer restored dignity to many. It also depended on housing, income, clinics, medication, transportation, and families capable of carrying responsibilities once held by an entire institution. When those supports failed, freedom could become another kind of abandonment. Pilgrim stands between those two dangers. Too much institution, and a patient may disappear behind the walls. Too little support, and the same person may disappear beyond them. This is why the story cannot end with the demolition of an abandoned ward. Pilgrim is not merely a ruin from an unenlightened age. It remains an operating hospital because the need that created it never vanished. The scale changed. The obligation did not. The old census tells the story in numbers: 100 patients when Pilgrim opened, 2018 within 9 months, 13,875 at its peak, 350 patients in a lobotomy study, 12 operations on the day Beulah Jones entered surgery. Then the population began to fall. Every period found a number that appeared to prove progress. At first, it was the number of beds New York could build. Later, it was the number of patients doctors could calm. Then it became the number of people who could be discharged and the number of wards the state could close. But numbers could not measure what Beulah's children lost during the 20 years their mother lived inside Pilgrim. They could not distinguish between a patient who recovered and one who merely became easier to manage. They could not show whether someone leaving the hospital found a home or simply stopped appearing on the institution's records. Pilgrim was always able to count the people within its walls. Its history asks what happened when counting became a substitute for knowing them. The $7 million decision made sense in 1927. New York needed 10,000 beds, and one large hospital appeared more efficient than 2 smaller ones. The calculation was correct. Its answer was incomplete. It measured construction costs, duplicated services, and available beds. It could not calculate the human cost of concentrating thousands of distressed people inside one system. Nor could later officials fully calculate the cost of sending them back into communities without enough support. Nearly a century after Pilgrim opened, modern buildings continue to operate beside the remains of the city that came before them. The power of the old institution has diminished. Its population is now measured in hundreds rather than nearly 14,000. Its treatment programs speak of recovery, self-determination, and life in the community. The roads still cross the grounds. The name remains. Pilgrim survived because society never solved the problem it was built to contain. It only learned that no single building could solve it.